Good morning, everybody. Happy Wednesday. A storm is coming here in Songdo Town. Whenever I look out my window, I judge the weather by what the flags are doing. On the main street outside my window, there are all these flags from different countries, so I can see Italy and maybe Russia, and a green one with a red dot in the middle. What the hell is that flag? I just Googled it. It's Bangladesh. The green flag with the red sun in the middle. Just the perfectly red circle in the middle of a green... How do they say in Game of Thrones? Or in medieval speak, it's like a red disc on a green field. It's Bangladesh. I had no idea. And the flags are... I don't even know where. I guess it's in India or somewhere close to India, Central Asia. So a storm is coming, storm is brewing, and there are clouds on the way, and a system is moving in, and that's there's something very inherently literary there, or poetic, the idea of the foreboding, or what is it? It's foreshadowing. So the wind and the clouds and the horizon is a great foreshadowing of something that's stirring in the soul or in the mind or just physically in the outer world. I don't know what I'm talking about. This morning, it's Wednesday morning and the flags are whipping and a storm is coming. It's summertime. I used to love summers, but these days I hate them. When you're a kid, summers are the best. And when you're an adult, summers are just hot. That's my hot take today. So I've been working on my story this week. Not as much as I would like to report that I have, but I have been working on it throughout the ups and downs of whatever busyness that life has thrown at me this week. Just to be honest, for this morning, the way that I'm feeling this morning is I've just been struggling with this idea that I'm not a very good writer because I haven't been writing very much. And I'm trying to get back into the habit of actually putting words down. And I'm sort of caught in this limbo where I'm thinking a lot about my story, but I'm not actually putting words on the page. And that's sort of my ultimate problem that I've always dealt with. So that's bugging me a little bit this morning, that I'm not doing as well as I think I should be. And then that's the double-edged sword, I guess, is first you have a small failure, which is that you don't write enough, or you aren't creative enough, or you don't make your video, or whatever it is that you think you should be doing. And then the second sword is the twist of the dagger, is the guilt that you feel after you don't do it. And so I'm trying to work past that and just focus and be productive instead of feeling bad or procrastinating. And I want to start this episode off with a short chapter from The War of Art by Steven Pressfield. This was a really instrumental work and inspiring me early on when I was just deciding that I wanted to try this writing thing. And The War of Art is a play on the classic work, The Art of War. And what Steven Pressfield talks about in The War of Art is how to go from just being a sort of hobbyist creative to someone who's an actual artist and who takes it seriously as their profession. How to go from that weird sort of insecure place of, hey, I'm just doing this as a hobby, and if I fail, no one will care, and how to advance or progress from there into someone who takes their art seriously. That's what The War of Art is all about. And he puts forth the great concept of resistance, and he talks about it in spiritual terms, but I think he does a good job of keeping it practical as well, and thinking about all the ways in our life where we find resistance, which are all the different barriers whether mental or spiritual, whatever the barrier is that keeps us from doing the work that we feel like we should be doing. Anyway, the book has this fun sort of Spartan warrior, stoic philosopher feel and format to it. So it has these short chapters with interesting headings, and each chapter or each section is short and sort of a philosophical thought. So I'm going to read this short section from The War of Art. This one actually comes towards the end of the novel. And the headline, the title for this chapter is called The Artist's Life. Are you born a writer? Were you put on earth to be a painter, a scientist, an apostle of peace? In the end, the question can only be answered by action. Do it or don't do it. It may help to think of it this way. If you were meant to cure cancer or write a symphony or crack cold fusion and you don't do it, you not only hurt yourself, even destroy yourself. You hurt your children. You hurt me. You hurt the planet. You shame the angels who watch over you and spite the Almighty who created you and only you with your unique gifts for the sole purpose of nudging the human race 1 millimeter farther along its path back to God. Creative work is not a selfish act or a bid for attention on the part of the actor. It's a gift to the world and every being in it. Don't cheat us of your contribution. Give us what you've got. Fucking empowering, is it not? That whole book is filled with gems like that, and that's why I've always kept The War of Art, and I have it as a Kindle book. And I like having a few books like that. I have my favorite fantasy book in there, Name of the Wind. And I like having a few books on my Kindle that just no matter what, if I'm ever caught somewhere and I don't have a book, or I'm traveling, I'm in between books, or whatever, you're at the DMV or some stupid government office and you're waiting in line for an hour. I like having a few things on my phone like that I can always just pick up. And so I have The War of Art on my Kindle, and it's always good to come back for it. On times like this morning when I'm kind of questioning myself, it's good to read something like that and feel empowered that that's the whole reason I'm doing this thing, is because I know I have something inside of me, and it's not only painful to me, but it hurts others around me if I'm procrastinating and if I'm not able to get that out of my system and become the best version of myself. And that's why I've been so surprised how this whole creative process and this writing struggle I've been on, how important it's become for me. And maybe it's become too important to the point where it's now crippling, because I know how important it is for my own psyche and for my family and everyone around me. And I know how important it is that I need to do this. And I know that success is not just, I won't just write the story, and that's not the end of the success. The success is the feeling within myself of creating something and putting it out there and overcoming those fears of perfectionism and the fear of failure and the fear of criticism and the fear of just making your inner self known to the world. I think that's maybe an underrated fear that creatives go through that I bet is actually really common. It's just the creative process is so unique to yourself, and it comes from such a deep place. If you're doing it well and doing it the right way, you're bringing up the things you feel the most, and then you're sharing those with the world. That's why it's easy to get scared and hide under a rock rather than publish your works. So all these things are difficult when you're trying to be a creative, and I've talked about before how my biggest problem is I have all these ideas and I get caught up brainstorming and world building, and I go down a bunch of rabbit holes, and it's hard for me to just narrow it down to a couple of options and just hammer out a specific story. And so last week I talked about writing to market and Chris Fox and this idea of knowing who your readers are, knowing what genre you're writing in. And I talked about urban fantasy. And I still think that what I'm writing is an urban fantasy. And this week I've done a sort of, I guess you could say, a deep dive. I've listened to more podcasts and I've been watching YouTube videos more about urban fantasy, finding author interviews and authors who write in urban fantasy. And the thing that's comforting for me as someone who's a writer who's not yet an author, who's trying to find his way, and as someone who personally struggles with having too many options and not being able to narrow them down, the solace that I'm taking in this right to market idea is that it takes a lot of the options off the table. So what you can do when you say, okay, I'm going to write sci-fi, or I'm going to write epic fantasy, or I'm going to write a murder mystery, well, that immediately narrows down 90% of your choices that are out there in the universe. It's the difference between being in class and the professor saying, okay, everybody this week, write me an essay. It's the difference between that and the professor telling you, okay, class, this week I want you to write me an essay on your opinion on whether or not aliens are real. You may not like the constrictions of the essay, or you may not like the rules that your professor, the parameters they've put on your essay, but at least you know what you're going to write about, and you can say what you think or not, and it's easier that way. And I think something that's tempting for young people and for creatives is to try to push the boundaries or revolt against the boundaries and say, oh, I don't believe in these boundaries, I want to be free to do whatever I want. But there's actually some sort of freedom and discipline. And I think especially as a new writer, the best thing you can do is constrict yourself and this is something I did when I first started writing short stories, is I just said, hey, look at this action sequence. I just saw this in a TV show and I wonder if I can write that. And then I would try to write a specific, whether it was an action scene or a horror scene, and just the practice of actually doing it and failing and learning what I did right or did wrong went a long ways towards helping me get better as a writer. So I've known for quite a while that I wanted to write urban fantasy. It was part of the shift that I made from the more epic fantasy style novels that I've written in the past. And I decided for a lot of different reasons that I liked to go this route. The main reason being that I would be able to write something that's closer to my own experience. Because I live in a city, in a big, strange, modern city, one that's pretty much, it's rightfully weird enough on its own that it's a great setting, and I can take the setting, the things that are familiar for me, and turn those into a fantastical setting, or add some fantastical elements to that world, to that real world. And then I can have this blend of the modern world and the fantastical world, which is still fantasy, which I have always read and still is the most interesting to me. And it just made sense to me that urban fantasy is where those ideas come together the most, obviously, as far as a genre that I could be writing in. And so ever since then, that was a few months ago where I had that realization that was what I was going to do. And I've always sort of known that this new story I was writing would be urban fantasy. So what I did is I started reading a lot more of urban fantasy. I had read some, but not much. So I started reading more of the iconic text in that genre. And I think what I've done this week, I've had to remind myself, because I've been brainstorming so much in my world, and I've been thinking so hard about what the start of my story should be. And I guess last week when I was talking about Chris Fox and Right to Market, it just hit me, just was a no-brainer. Like, no shit. You're trying to narrow down your options. So what you should do is look back at your genre and see what the conventions are. And just, again, I'm so far, I'm not one of those pretentious creators who thinks that or I should say naive creators who thinks that I'm going to reinvent the wheel or that I'm going to do something great and original that's never been done before. I'm way past that. I'm way too humble and realistic for that. I'm not trying to paint the Mona Lisa. I'm just trying to copy other works and copy the genre that I know sells well, but put my twist on it. And I think that's what you can do in the internet age, is you can give people what they like, but do it with your unique personality attached to it, and that's what makes you different. So a couple days ago, I was on YouTube and I was browsing all of the videos from this guy named Michael Ronn. Michael Ronn is just he's just killing it, man. He's written like 20 books, and he has a podcast, and he has a YouTube channel. And once I found his YouTube videos just by complete accident because it showed up in my search feed, then I realized that I'd actually heard this guy a lot before. I'd heard him on the Joanna Penn podcast and on Rocking Self-Publishing a year or two ago, at least, maybe more. And that's when I knew, okay, this guy's been around for a long time, and he's killing the game, and he's not going anywhere. I think in the creative world or the entrepreneur world, when you see someone like that who's just stuck it out for a long time, that's really admirable, because it's so easy for people in the self-publishing world to fall off the wayside or to start a project and then to fall off in a couple of years. You know, it's like when you find a new podcast you like, I always immediately check how many episodes there are. And it's comforting when you see someone that's been around for a long time, you know, that they've got their shit together and they're not going to fall off. It's like readers talk a lot about how some readers won't start a trilogy or won't start a new series unless the series is already finished, because they're afraid of getting burned by someone like George R.R. Martin, getting halfway through a series and then having to wait 10 years for the next sequel. So I found this Michael Ronn guy who I already sort of knew, but I never had seen his face before, and I was watching some of his videos, and he has one of the best videos about urban fantasy tropes that I've ever found. You know what videos I don't like are this, there's a lot of videos like top 10 cliche tropes, or top 10 writer mistakes, or top 5 writing cliches I hate. I don't know. I just don't like those. Those videos just seem so bitchy to me. I think it's more productive or more constructive to talk about the tropes that are out there and to recognize that they can be done poorly or they can be done well. But I don't want to watch a video of someone just saying things that they don't like. I guess it just strikes me as pretentious if you're saying, you know, these are the top 6 things that all writers do that are so cliche, that I see, that I can tell that these are so cliche. And of course I would never do these things in my stories. I don't know, it just feels gross to me. So a lot of times when you're researching and trying to find out about tropes in different genres, you see those kind of videos like top 5 things I hate about science fantasy. And so it was refreshing to me to find this Michael Ronn video where he talked about urban fantasy tropes. And I'll link to his information in my podcast show notes because I'm talking about him so much, and I'm using all the genius work that he did to consolidate all of this information. I'm just regurgitating it right now, but I'm just going to go over them real quickly. So he said that these are the top 10 urban fantasy tropes that he mentioned. Number 1, magic is usually hidden. Number 2, the city has a seedy underbelly. Number 3, culture clash. Number 4, mythical creatures. Number 5, vampires and werewolves. Number 6, creature twist, which is that you have these mythical creatures, but you put your own spin on it. Number 7, the main character has a unique job. Number 8, the hero in hiding, which is kind of like the chosen one trope. Number 9, the first person point of view, which Michael Ronn thinks this is the most important trope in urban fantasy and probably the one that you skip at your peril the most. And number 10 is love, and the distinction that he made between urban fantasy and paranormal romance, which is something that I've been struggling with too. The way he defines it is he said that urban fantasy has, in urban fantasy, conflict comes first, and then the love interest comes second. Whereas in paranormal romance, the love interest comes first, and the conflict comes second. So it's really a matter of priority and what's most important in your story. This stuff about genre and reader expectations is really fascinating to me. I guess when I was younger, or before I actually tried to write a story myself, I didn't think about it much. I would just pick up a book because someone else told me they liked it, or because the cover looked good, or because it was actually on my dad's bookshelf, or because we actually had it at home. But you would just read something and you either liked it or you didn't like it. And I think that what you're trying to do with book marketing, with your title and your cover, and then your first chapter, and then the tropes that you're hitting, is you're trying to make it so that people who will like your book are the ones who actually read it as much as possible, and people who won't like your book will obviously can figure that out sooner rather than later. That's the whole goal. It's not that you want everybody to like your book, it's that you want more people to be pleased and less people to be angry, because the ones who would never have liked your book because they don't like those tropes or that genre will never have picked it up in the first place, because it'll be clear to them that this is the kind of book that they don't like. So the most obvious example you can think of is a steamy romance novel with a hulky dude on the front with his shirt off. That's a really, that's the most kick in the face advertisement you can give, that this is a steamy romance novel. It's not just that the idea is not that romance novel or that author wants to please all the readers in the world. The idea is that author wants to find the exact readers for them who they know want that kind of story, and they want to keep out the readers who don't want that kind of story. And that's why the cover is so important. But when you get into the weeds of this stuff, it starts to get more complicated, because of course the genres are always blending together and nothing's ever black and white. Even though somebody like Michael Ronn has identified really well these 10 urban fantasy tropes, there are still subgenres and a lot of places where they cross. And the one that has been most confusing to me lately is paranormal romance, when mixed with urban fantasy. So I was reading this. I told you last week I'm reading A Discovery of Witches by Deborah Harkness. And I had this experience as I'm reading this novel where I started reading it and I was intrigued. I liked it. And then the second or third chapter, something happened, which was she delivered a trope, and my heart just kind of sank, and I realized, shit, this isn't the kind of story that I want to be reading. So I'll just explain it real quick. I think I told you last time, the way that A Discovery of Witches starts is you have this woman, this historian, who's studying these ancient books, and one of the books is magical. And that's intriguing, and I love that about urban fantasy, is there's this mystery behind the regular mundane reality of the normal world. And she has this conflict: should I open the book or not? She is a witch, but she is trying to run from her witch history. And I like that first chapter. I'm pretty much all in. I think it's I'm curious. She's hooked me what the mystery is. But then the second chapter was this really common sort of paranormal romance trope, which I don't like, or which I'm just not as interested in, where the woman is in the library and she's doing her thing and she feels eyes on the back of her neck, and she turns around and there's this really sexy, calm, composed vampire dude who's watching her, and he's interested in her and he knows all about her. And it just gave me the Twilight feels, you know? So she turns around and this vampire is, you know, she describes the vampire, his hard brow line and his jaw and his perfectly tailored clothes and his nice haircut. And as I was reading that, my heart was just thinking like, oh, fuck, this isn't the story that I want to read. And that's interesting to me because I think, you know, if I was reading this 5 years ago, I would just put the book down, or maybe, I don't know. I don't like stopping books in the middle, so I'll trudge through a book to the end, even if I hate it for some reason. I don't know why I do that, but now as I'm reading that and having that experience, I'm realizing, okay, I'm a reader with certain expectations, and right now my expectations aren't being met, or I'm being surprised in a bad way, where I thought I was going to have more of a fantasy-driven, conflict-driven, mystery-driven story, and now I'm getting this sort of this popular romance trope, which is the sort of, you know, the Twilight trope of the helpless or the innocent or the sort of naive girl who's confronted by this very intimidating but very handsome and brilliant and more intelligent vampire or supernatural creature or whatever he is. And I don't know, maybe, you know, I like reading Philip Marlowe and Harry Dresden and the detective style stories. And in those stories, the trope that you get is the sort of hard-boiled detective is sitting in his office, and then some beautiful damsel in distress walks in the door. So the detective is in his office, and then some woman walks in the door, and then you get the description about her hourglass figure and her flowing hair and all that stuff. So maybe that's how, I'm sure there are a lot of women, or not just women, but people who don't like that genre or that trope. If they got that on accident, their heart would sink, and then they wouldn't be interested in that story anymore. Just like as I'm reading this fantasy novel, and then I get the description of the handsome, immaculate, flawless, intelligent vampire dude who, of course, has a really keen interest in the female protagonist and knows all about her, and he's stalking her in this creepy way, but probably later we're going to find out that he's actually trying to protect her or help her, or they're going to have some sort of romantic relationship. I just could care less about that. So that was a big bummer for me as I was reading that story. But I've gone on to read a little bit more because it's interesting to me. So what I said earlier, Michael Ronn said that with urban fantasy, you can have love and you can have conflict, but what readers want to know is that, you know, conflict is first and love is second. And that in a paranormal romance, where you're more used to seeing werewolves and vampires and, you know, romantic relationships between different strange creatures, you can, like when you read Patricia Briggs, I think it's A Moon Called, there's always this sort of sexual tension between, she's a coyote, but she is going around with these packs of wolves, and in the wolves there's the dominant male. And to me, it's like, it's so funny how it's sort of like this soft porn dynamic playing out, where there's the dominance hierarchy, and the dominant male is handsome and brutish, and he's the beast, and then everyone else is submissive to him. And of course the female is always fighting off the advances of the dominant male. Anyways, I'm not sure where I'm going with that, other than to say that the male fantasy is sort of tried and true, and the female fantasy of the knight in shining armor is tried and true. I guess the male fantasy is the damsel in distress. And both of them, that's the thing, they're both tropes, and they can be done well and they can be done poorly, but they're never going to go away, because whether you're a man or woman or any sort of on the sliding scale of however you think along those lines, how can I say that? I guess what I'm saying is that, gender aside, whatever you're interested in, whether it's the damsel in distress or the knight in shining armor, both of those tropes are tried and true, and those are things that people are always going to feel and people are always going to be interested in. But what's most fascinating about the genre conventions is that, based on what you put on your cover, you can let people know that they're going to get that, and then when they pick it up and they get that, they're going to be happy. But if they pick it up and they're surprised that they get something else, they're going to be unhappy. And so I've continued to read this Discovery of Witches book because I'm not sure yet. It's interesting to me, is this strange love story going to drive the action in the novel and this love interest that they have, or is the conflict of the witches and the magic book and whatever is brewing on like the global conflict level, is that what's going to drive the story? And I think that actually the love interest is going to take a back seat. But for me, if that's what I'm getting, is all these descriptions of the handsome vampire and how the woman feels nervous under his gaze, that's just, I'm just going to get tired of that at some point and stop reading it. But it's helped me. It's been a weird experience reading this story, but it's helped me think about what I'm doing with my story and what's important to me, and how I can start my own novel in a way that meets people's expectations and doesn't, scare them off right off the bat. So a lot of these, when I go back down the list of the top 10, what Michael Ronn is talking about, the hidden magic is number 1. That's the kind of world I've created. The seedy underbelly of the city, number 2. That also goes along with the kind of world I created. Culture clash, yes. Mythical creatures, yes. I think you can make it as weird as you want in urban fantasy as long as you're consistent. And then the main character, this is the one that's interesting to me, that I've been rethinking my story now. The main character having a unique job. That I think is a really fun trope, and that's one that I actually like with the Philip Marlowe stories, even though those are just hard-boiled crime. They're not urban fantasy. But it has this fun sort of serial feel to the story where you get to live the main character's life, and you're going to always find them in their office and their comfortable surroundings. The Patricia Briggs novel, which I don't like, those aren't my favorite stories, but I appreciate how popular they are. And what she's done is, her main character is a shapeshifter who's an auto mechanic, and that's something that urban fantasy readers love, is to see supernatural creatures living in the daily world doing their normal daily shit. So that's interesting to me because I've been thinking with my story that I want to tell this story of this werewolf who comes to Tomorrow City and doesn't know that he's a werewolf. And I realize that I'm still trying to tell sort of an epic fantasy coming of age origin story because I'm teaching this world to myself as I write it. And so I'm telling the origin story of my hero when maybe what I should be doing is teaching the origin story to my, did I say religion? Origin. I should be teaching the origin story to myself when actually maybe the story that I should present, the first novel, should be my character who's at home in his world and is doing his job, because that's such a common trope of urban fantasy. And if the story opened with, Sal Paradise, he's the werewolf delivery man in the city, then that's what you can market it as, and people will know exactly what they're getting. I listened to another interviewer the other day where she was talking about this. There was an author talking about a novel series that she was writing called Dwarf the Bounty Hunter. And she was saying that it's good if you can have your, whatever your mythical creature is, a dwarf, and their job, if you just put it in the title, then you do such a good job of marketing that right off the bat so that nobody's surprised when they pick up your story. So I was going down the list and I was trying to think of what I could call my story, the werewolf of Tomorrow City, the werewolf in the city, that's too broad and too general, and maybe it's been done before. But if you knew his job, if it was the werewolf delivery man, or the werewolf in the tower, or the werewolf pizza guy, but I like that idea of just being as upfront as possible. And the thing about my story, it's going to take place in Korea, so I'm wondering, how obvious should that be in the marketing? It feels to me like it should be upfront and center, and that there should be maybe there should be Korean writing, or there should be something obviously Korean about the story, because it's good to just pick a few, to know exactly what your story is and lean into it. So you don't want to call it something cheesy like the Korean werewolf in the city or the werewolf in the East Asian city. You got to come up with something better than that. But the point is that you don't want to surprise people to not know that they're going to be in Asia, or to think that they're going to be somewhere else and then shock them in a bad way. You want to make it obvious from the beginning so that actually you can market the story to people who live in Korea, or who are interested in Korea, or who have some other association with Korea, people who are actually going to like it for those reasons. So these are all the 1,000,001 rabbit holes that I go down when thinking about how to craft my story. But the big one for me right now is I'm trying to decide if I should, the title I can figure out later. The cover, obviously, that stuff comes much later down the road when the final decision will come much later down the road. But at the same time, what Chris Fox talks about with writing to market is that actually you should, if you can visualize those things before you start writing and have a clearer picture of what you're writing, then you can do a better job of writing to market. And that's something that I think self-published authors who are in it for the career and who are in it for the money and for the practical purposes, they do a really good job of that. And I think self-published authors do an awesome job of blending their desire to be creative and artistic and marrying that with their desire to be practical and live in the real world and pay the bills. And that's what I'm interested in. That's what makes the most sense to me, and that's what I really want to do. So I'm trying to think about all these tropes and how I can narrow it down and have a good focus of my story before I start writing it. And the decision I'm going to try to make this week is whether I should just go all in with the urban fantasy trope about the job maybe I should just start with a day in the life of my character working his job in the city and ground the readers in the world that way. And maybe later I can tell his origin story, either with like a prequel novel or, I'm not a big fan of flashbacks, but if I found out a way to do it well, then I could do it in a like the current day in his world, but then flashing back to his origin story. It's obviously important that I know the origin story, so maybe I just have to write that story before I can catch up to the present day. And maybe that's what I'm going through right now, is that I do need to write that origin story just to learn it myself so that I can catch up to the current moment with my main character. So that's what I've been thinking about this week, is writing to market, not trying to do too many things or get lost down all these rabbit holes, but just trying to remember, okay, my story's taking place in Korea. I am going to use a werewolf as my main character, and I am going to write in this urban fantasy setting where there's a magical world, but it happens behind the veil of the regular world. And just to lean into those things and to use those parameters to just let myself write a story, because as soon as I start writing, I have fun with it, and I discover new things. But it's so important for me, as someone who gets lost in all the options, it's important to give myself a solid framework for what I'm doing so that I can avoid falling into the trap of too many options, and so that I can just keep moving forward. Because like Steven Pressfield said in The War of Art, all it comes down to is action. Whether you're an artist or not, everyone has a creative side to them, but the artists are the ones who act on it and actually do it and actually get their stuff out there. And that's the hurdle that I'm trying to get over. So hopefully that'll help me this week to have a better framework and to think about these urban fantasy tropes and just lean into it. And hey, it's exciting to me actually to have some of these answers and to have a little bit clearer idea. And then when I ask myself, like I said, this thing about my character and what's his job going to be, well, I can think about what other stories have done well, and I can decide what I like the most about that, and I can choose my own, pick my own flavor within the known arena of what other urban fantasy authors have done. And so hopefully that'll work for me. So that's it. That's where my thoughts are at this week. I'm trying not to be paralyzed by inaction and trying to just push forward a little bit at a time. And I hope that all this brainstorming and all this thinking about genre is worth it and will help me have a stronger story than if I was just to sit down and write whatever popped into my head. And I'll report back next week as always. And I'm looking out my window now, and the flags are whipping even harder. So a storm is definitely coming, and hopefully that's not bad foreshadowing for my writing career. Hopefully it means that things are happening. That's how I'm going to take it. Change is coming. The winds are picking up. Action is happening, and I'm not going to be stagnant anymore. And good things are on the horizon. And what we need to do as creatives is we need to put ourselves out there and not be afraid. So go forward with that, all you badass, creative, lovely people out there. I hope you have a wonderful Wednesday, and I hope that my ramblings have helped you in some small way. And hopefully we can get through this crazy process together. Thank you guys so much. Have a good Wednesday. I will talk to you again very soon.